We're very excited to be co-hosting another event with Radnor Memorial Library. And of course, we're excited to welcome George Anastasia and Ralph Cipriano, sorry, who will be discussing Dr. Dealer, the true, almost local story of one man's descent into evil and the people he took with him. It's a story about a doctor who helped flood the street with opioids, about a husband who hid dark secrets from two wives, and about a man so consumed with greed and arrogance that he thought he could get away with murder. The story is told by two accomplished reporters and authors who have worked together on stories for the Philadelphia Inquirer. George is the author of 6 true crime novels, or true crime nonfiction books, including Gotti's Rules and Blood and Honor. We steadily sell his backlist to all of those who are interested in the mafia, and it's definitely a lot of fun. Ralph is the author of 3 books on Vincent Fumo, John Vesey, and Jim Beasley, and has been writing articles exposing corruption in Philly for decades, from City Hall to Ivy League football teams. We have books available for sale at Main Point Books and through our website at mainpointbooks.com. We're going to mute everybody while the authors speak, and please feel free to unmute yourself at the end to ask questions. Thank you.
George, is this our time?
This is.
I guess.
Yes, it is.
We're ready to roll. All right. Serendipitously, about a couple of years ago, I got a call from Andrew Glick, who was a pagan motorcycle member who was involved in this conspiracy, the murder conspiracy and the drug dealing conspiracy. And he called me out of the blue and basically was looking for somebody to write a book about his situation. And almost at the same time, Ralph was in contact with Carol Weintraub. And Ralph called me and said, I'm talking to this woman. I said, I'm talking to this guy. And I think basically what we said is between the two of them, we had a unique take on this. I don't want to use the word fascinating, but intriguing murder mystery. And that's the way we tried to approach it. I had the biker, and Ralph, why don't you talk a little bit about Carol and how you connected with her and how she fits into the picture here.
So I was given a talk. Can everybody hear me? I'll assume yes. Okay, everybody's okay. I was giving a talk about the book I wrote about Vince Fumo at the Union League of all places, and Carol was a member there. And afterwards, she came up to me and introduced herself and said, "I've got an interesting story that you might be, find of some interest." And she started to tell me a little bit about her situation. And I went home and looked it up, and then that's when I started talking to George. And I really didn't think I could do a book on, just what happened to her. And then George started telling me about what was going on with Andrew Glick, and George is right. That's when we decided, well, maybe we've got two halves of an interesting story here. And I really think that they balance each other out and give some contrasting views of some pretty strange characters. So I've worked with George for, my God, has it been 30 years, George?
Easy. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, we used to, when there were mob hits in South Philadelphia, I was the guy who ran around on the streets banging on doors and asking people, hey, what was Johnny Gons like? The guy they shot 10 minutes ago. And George would be working his mob contacts. So we used to work together on mob stuff quite a bit. And this story came together fairly easily. George is very easy to work with. And I think we had some fun with it.
Yeah, and it was, we say this right in the beginning of the book. We've got a lot of facts, and it's a fascinating story, but neither one of us, I think, we don't know the absolute truth in all of this. There's still so many unanswered questions. But when you put in all the elements that we have the biker gang, the outlaw bikers, you got the opioid crisis, you've got 2 different women that were married to this individual, Dr. James Kaufman, and their perceptions of who he was. And I think we're able to tell the story from a couple different levels. And I think we're able to paint a pretty broad picture of what happened and why it happened. That's ultimately what you want to try to do is tell a story in a way that brings the reader along and lets the reader inside a world that they may not be aware of or may not be a part of. And I think we were able to do that through Carol and through Andrew Blake.
The fun part of the story, as George mentioned, we are talking about two different wives, wife number 2 and wife number 3 of Dr. Kaufman. And both were, I guess, at least at the start, charmed by the guy. And each of them had a daughter. And both of the daughters came to the exact same conclusion about Dr. Kaufman. They hated him. They thought he was evil. They thought he was conning their moms. And I guess the moral of our story is daughter knows best, because it turned out that the two daughters had the right read on this guy.
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating things. These two, there were adult daughters. They're daughters from previous marriages. Neither one knows the other. Neither one has ever, I believe, spoken to the other. Yet they both had the same kind of relationship with James Kaufman. And in essence, they both saw him for who he was. Whereas their mothers, his wives, for the longest time did not. And April Kaufman ultimately paid with her life because of that. And Carol, I think through the book, I think we track Carol's first impression of who Dr. Kaufman was and who she wanted him to be, and ultimately, I think, who she came to believe he was. And then against all this backdrop, we've got biker gangs and we've got an opioid pill mill operation. I don't know if people are familiar with a pill mill is. I mean, you got a doctor writing phony scripts for individuals for Percocet, opioids, OxyContin. They go to the pharmacy, they get the pills, and then they take it out on the streets and they sell the pills for $30 a pop. It's one of the reasons, we have the opioid crisis. You say, where are these drugs coming from? This was a microcosm of how that happens. And so there's a lot of different things in play in this particular book, and I think we were able to tie it all together.
The fun part is that was only the opioid sidelight for Dr. Kaufman was only one of the several scams that he had going. George, why don't you tell them about the compound cream scheme, which is my favorite.
Yeah, I mean, he made some money with the bikers with the pills, but he made serious money. We're talking tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars with the compound cream scam. And this is a scam that's it's been going on around the country. A lot of different places it's happened. It's basically what happens is you get a network of people who go to a doctor who's part of this conspiracy. The doctor writes a script for compound cream. Basically, you say, I can't take the pill. I'm allergic to a pill. I've got this pain in my elbow. I can't use this, can't do that. And he's got to write a specific script. You can't just go get a tube of Bengay. He writes a script. And there's a pharmaceutical people are involved, the doctors are involved, and basically insurance companies are built. Some of these scripts were these tubes of cream, a 1 month supply of cream, anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 for 1 month. Now he's writing a script for a year, and if you got 12 scripts and you've got 200 patients, do the math. It's serious money. A bunch of individuals in Atlantic County have been indicted and charged in this scam. Dr. Kaufman probably would have been had he not killed himself after being arrested for the murder of his wife. And that was where the big money was. And in a separate scam, he was working a deal with a blood lab. They were doing testing blood work, and he was getting a kickback on that as well. So this was a guy who was a doctor, first do no harm, treating patients. And Ralph, Ralph, your experience from talking to people, a lot of his patients really liked him. The people who were being treated for diabetes and those kind of things.
They loved it. They all, I got letters from them. I saw the letters that they wrote to the doctor when he was in jail. They idolized this guy. Apparently, he was a gifted doctor and he was able to help a lot of people, which makes it even more of a tragedy. But he had just a complete hold on his patients. And like Carol, his wife number 3, tells us a story of she was walking into a diner with him, and he sees one of his patients, a diabetic, chomping down on a big stack of pancakes. And as soon as the patient sees the doctor, he puts his head down and he's all ashamed. And the doctor walks up to him and gives him a lecture in the middle of the diner about, you're killing yourself. And that's the kind of And the guy is apologizing over his pancakes. That's the kind of hold that this guy had over his patient.
Yeah, and a lot of them appreciated that. I think what I think we've come to believe and what we write about in the book is Dr. Kaufman was an individual who showed a different side of himself to whoever he was with. He had different personas, and depending on the situation, that's who he would be. When he was dealing with his patients, he was this caring but hard individual who wanted them to do what they needed to do to survive. When he was with his wives, charming may not be the right word, but he was a husband who was providing and who was somebody who enjoyed the status and the wealth and the trappings of his life. When he was with the bikers, he wanted to be a tough guy, even though it didn't fit who he was. So, he was all of those things to all of those different people. And eventually, I think he got to a point where, what do you think, Ralph? I mean, he opted to end his life rather than go on trial because he didn't want to face the music. I mean, I think that's apparently what it was.
Yeah, that's very sad for us because, well, I mean, he did leave us the suicide note, which goes on page after page. And boy, psychiatrists would have a ball with that. But George and I were both disappointed that the case never went to trial because Dr. Kaufman wasn't alive to go to trial because he had one of the great mob lawyers of all time, Eddie Jacobs, who successfully defended many mobsters. I saw him beat 5 murder raps in one courtroom on behalf of Joey Merlino and his gang. Joey used to be the mob boss in Philadelphia. And so, I think we were all cheated out of an incredible trial. And my money would have been on Eddie Jacobs because he was just so good at destroying cooperating government witnesses. It was really one of his strengths. And George, you've seen him do that many times, right?
Oh yeah, I think it would have been a totally different kind of case had Kaufman not killed himself and had he gone to trial. It would have been interesting on a couple different levels. I mean, the government's case was built around cooperating witnesses. Every one of those witnesses had baggage, credibility problems. I mean, our guy Andrew Glick was an admitted drug dealer, and he began cooperating after he was arrested for dealing drugs. So yeah, it would have been interesting to see a strong cross-examination and whether the case would have held up. At the same time, what you had was the leader of the biker gang, a guy named Freddie Ogello, and Dr. Kaufman charged with murder. And in essence, if they had both been on trial together, it would have been interesting to see how each would have defended, or if the other would have pointed the finger at the co-defendant. Kaufman, to his grave, was claiming he was not involved in the murder, and he blamed the bikers for that. But as we said, I mean, this is just another example of him kind of controlling the narrative throughout his life. I think that's what he tried to do. It's a fascinating story on that level. I think it's also, I mean, Ralph and I, we've talked about this. We have clearly a different perspective. We're not women, but there's a certain women's perspective in all of this. Carol Weintraub, who reconnected with Dr. Kaufman after many, many years and became his third wife, well, Ralph, you talked about it. I mean, this is their upbringing. This is where they were. And she was trying to look back, I guess, 40 years when they were high school sweethearts.
Yeah, and I guess this is a cautionary tale. If any of you gals out there, if your old high school boyfriend shows up, maybe you should run them through Google. But Carol and Dr. Kaufman were high school sweethearts. She was a freshman when he was a senior, so he was an older man, and he was her first love. And in my mind, that's the only way he had access to her because she didn't see him for what he was. She saw him as, the boy she left behind. And they grew up, they had very similar backgrounds. They were both from blue collar Jewish families. They lived in the same, almost identical, one level bungalows by beach. And both their dads were, battle-scarred war veterans who ran struggling bars. And so they had a lot of common. They went to the same synagogue as kids, and they went to the same high school. So, I think Carol basically said we're the same person. So when she met up with him 40 years later, she just saw the guy that she left behind and didn't see the killer that, that April's daughter saw, and she didn't see the evil, scheming guy that her own daughter saw. She just saw this blast from the past, and she was unhappy, and he was unhappy, and it was the third time around for marriage for both of them. And for a while, they were pretty happy.
I mean, the irony is they connect when she sends him a condolence note after learning through the newspaper that his wife had been murdered. And in essence, he's the murderer. He set the murder in motion. Carol doesn't know this. He certainly knows it. Yet he pursues her, and within a year they're married. And as Ralph said, for a while it looked like it was a happy ending. Love is better the second time around, that kind of thing. But then things started to come apart.
Yeah, they actually got together like 2 months after the murder, and
Right.
Carol ended up talking to her psychiatrist about that, saying, I like this guy and he seems wonderful, but gee, he's really getting over his wife's murder pretty quick, and I'm a little worried about that. So the psychiatrist suggests having Dr. Kaufman come in and talk to the two of them. Naturally, Dr. Kaufman shows up and he takes over the meeting with the psychiatrist because he's always the smartest guy in the room. And he pretty much talks his way through the whole thing. So you got to give him credit, he's good.
No, he was very consistent in terms of being the manipulator, no matter what his situation was. And I think he tried that with the bikers as well. And at least from Andrew Glick's perspective, Kaufman was able to manipulate Freddie Ogello, the leader of the biker gang. He was able to manipulate him. And there's a whole question, at least in Glick's mind, and I guess in my mind as well, is did the pagans use Kaufman to get involved in the opioid business, or did Kaufman use the opioids to bring the pagans into his orbit so that he could eventually prevail upon them to have his wife killed? And I tend to believe Kaufman was the manipulator here, and the pagans, and in a sense, the pagans were taken for a ride as well.
I've come around to that view, George. I think you're right about that because, they were making peanuts with the opioids, comparatively speaking. The doctor had much bigger scams going. So yeah, I came around to your way of thinking. But there was a while that many people, including Andrew Glick and including Carol, his third wife, didn't know if he was really dead or not because he committed suicide in prison. They never got to see the body. There was never any official paperwork that she got until way after this whole thing was flying along. And for a while, one of the first times I met Andrew Glick at his favorite biker diner down there in South Jersey, he was floating me the theory that Dr. Kaufman was alive and well somewhere in the witness protection program in the Midwest somewhere. And Carol was wondering, she had an urn with ashes in it in her bedroom, and she was wondering whose ashes were in it. So for a while, there was quite a bit of mystery around this.
Yeah, and to an extent, there's a lot of conspiracies still floating around the story. If you go online and you go on YouTube and folks down in Atlantic County, still a lot of talk about what happened, what really happened, who was really involved. I don't think there's, in my mind, I don't have any doubt that Kaufman was the one who set the murder in motion, and that Freddie Ogello was the guy who took the final step and hired a hitman. Now, the hitman himself ended up dead a year later from a drug overdose, which added a whole nother twist to all of this. Did he die of a drug overdose or was he killed? So, in terms of, I talk about this a lot, writing true crime. Sometimes you can't make it up any better than it is. And this story had so many twists and turns that if you're writing it as a novel, people might say, no, it's too bizarre. It wouldn't happen like that. But in this case, reality is more bizarre than fiction.
Well, and I also remember Andrew Glick is convinced, correct me if I'm wrong, George,
Yeah.
that it wasn't, Mulholland who fired the shots, the alleged hitman. He thinks that Dr. Kaufman wouldn't trust anybody to do the job himself. And that when the hitman shows up in the bedroom of April Kaufman and fires his shots, Glick thinks that the gal is already dead and that Kaufman shot her.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of these mysteries surrounding this story. There were 3 or 4 different autopsy reports, One set her death at like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, which was consistent with the conspiracy that Andrew's talking about. That Dr. Coffin himself killed his wife and then set the drug dealer up as a patsy. Other autopsies set her death at around 5:30, which is consistent with the theory of the case and how it all went down. And as we said, I mean, and we set this up in the opening of the book is, journalism is a search for the truth, but a lot of times what you have are a lot of facts and you don't know what the truth is. And we may never know what the total truth is in this case. And at the same time, you got Freddie Agello doing life in Trenton State Prison, insisting he's innocent. And, he's going to, ironically, I mean, he's complained more about, he was a kind of a musician on the side. He played the guitar. He's complained more about, we described him as kind of a second-rate Keith Richards than about him being a drug dealer and a murderer. Just the personalities in this book are fascinating. Andrew Glick is another one. Ralph loves the story about Glick. When I first got to meet him, we were talking about his life, and he was in the middle of a divorce. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." He said, "Well," he said, I brought my girlfriend home to live in the house." I said, "You brought your girlfriend home to live in the house with your wife?" He said, "Yeah, I think I crossed the line when I did that." I said, "In the same house?" He said, "Oh, it was a big house." I mean, that's Andrew Glick, very, very self-deprecating, not the typical, your image of a biker. He didn't fit that image. He was a chef. He worked at a senior citizen complex. He was the executive chef, preparing meals for like 200, 250 people a day. Made a lot of money, legitimate money, owned real estate. Yet he loved to ride bikes, and he got involved with the pagans, and he was a serious member of the pagans, the outlaw motorcycle guys. So, in that sense, I think the book also offers kind of a look at what that world is like, and it may not be what we typically think it is.
Well, the other thing that amazed me was Andrew Glick was also a very successful drug dealer. And he was looking at lots of years in prison when he flipped. And it's sort of a miracle. The guy, not only did he charm everybody, but he walked out of court without ever serving a day in jail, right, George? Did he ever?
Yeah, that's another example of what Eddie Jacobs would have eaten out of life. I mean, this is a guy who cooperates after being arrested for weapons and drug charges, serious drugs and weapons, and basically gets no time at all. Now, I've never seen that in any case. I mean, we've covered a lot of criminal cases. We've covered mob cases, cooperating mobsters. And invariably, they'll get a break, but they'll go to jail. Andrew Glick walked out of jail. No time at all. No jail time at all. It was and given a new identity and relocated in another part of the country. That's where he is right now.
And the other weird thing about this case is it just dragged on and on and on for years. I mean, you had a detective on it who must have figured everything out in the first month, who did it and what to do about it. And then years went by as the case dragged on and on and on. And George, you can tell us, I mean, there's a lot of different theories about why that happened.
Yeah, I mean, she's killed in June 2012. And you're right, we got access, and it's in the book, to the original detective reports for the first 2 or 3 months of the case. And at that point, they were pretty much on track to solve this case. And then things just bogged down. And nobody is sure why. I mean, there's a couple different theories. One is you had some changes in the prosecutor's office, and you had a new prosecutor in 2012 who was very cautious and very methodical. The other interesting theory, and one that if you go down to Atlantic County and start talking about this case, you'll hear it from a lot of people, is that April Kaufman, the woman who was killed, was somewhat promiscuous. She slept around, and she had a lot of different men she ended up in bed with. And some of those men were pretty politically connected or powerful people, and they didn't want any of that to come out. And I think that was kind of one of the backdrops here, is that this investigation was moving forward, but there were certain people who wanted to make sure that not everything would come out about who April Kaufman was and what her life was. She had a diary that disappeared. Nobody, I don't think to this day, has found the diary. So that's another, it takes you on a tangent. It doesn't help solve the murder mystery, but it might help explain why she was murdered in 2012, and it wasn't until 2017, 2018 that we started to see arrest and then a murder trial, almost a 6-year gap there. Her daughter, Kim Pack, was the catalyst for making this thing happen. Though we got to give credit where it's due. And we write a lot about Kim Pack. We didn't interview her, but we write a lot about her in the book. She and her lawyer were the crusaders that never let this die, this murder investigation. Never let anybody forget what happened to her mother. And Kim Pack, from almost day one, suspected her stepfather, Jim Kaufman, and she never let go of that. And that's one of the reasons I think we're sitting here talking about a murder case, indictments, arrests, and everything else that happened. So she's another woman in this story. And I think, too often you write true crime and it's a macho kind of world. And there's a lot of that here. But the women in this story are both the victims and the crusaders who made this thing come to an end.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, as we report in the book, when Dr. Kaufman told Kim, April's daughter, your mother's dead, the first words out of her mouth were, "What did you do?"
Yeah.
So
yeah.
she, from minute one, she had him framed as suspect number one, and he turned out to be pretty prescient.
Yeah, and at one point in the investigation, when things finally started to heat up toward the end, Glick says that Kaufman wanted he and Agello to get him a gun that couldn't be traced. And basically, when they wanted to know what he was going to do with the gun, he alluded to the fact that he was going to shut up some of these bitches that were causing all these problems. And the supposition was that was April Kaufman's friends and possibly her daughter, who would not let this case go. So, yeah, I mean, Kaufman was a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But at the end of the day, he wasn't a very nice guy, to say the least. And I was talking to somebody the other day, comparing him. I wouldn't compare Kaufman to any mobsters, but I would compare him to two other guys I've written about. Thomas Cipriano, the lawyer from Wilmington, Delaware, who murdered his mistress, Emily Fay, and Rabbi Fred Newlander, who hired a hitman to kill his wife. Newlander, Capano, and Kaufman are all cut from kind of the same cloth. Men who seem to have it all, status, power in the community, and reach a point where they literally think they can get away with murder. And I think that's where he fits. He doesn't fit in with gangsters and mobsters and bad guys that Ralph and I have written about. He fits in more with those kind of guys who think they're above the law, think they can get away with murder, think, as Ralph mentioned earlier, that think they're the smartest person in the room. That's who James Kaufman was.
I agree. Are we ready for questions, or should we go on pontificating some more?
Sure. Does anybody have any questions? I know Lindsay's got a few.
I've got a few, yeah. So I'm just gonna come out and say Kaufman was nuts. I mean, he was. When I was reading this, I actually started laughing at just how this guy was insane. I mean, he was walking around a funeral telling people they have nothing on me, like going after the insurance money less than 6 months after she's dead, and my God, I mean, this guy was a piece of work.
That also may go to his arrogance. I mean,
yeah,
he was an arrogant guy. Yeah.
Yeah, he really was. And I mean, I'm not even gonna lie. I definitely started laughing a couple of times because I'm just, how did this guy how was he not like,
But see, I think your take is similar to the two stepdaughters.
Right.
They were young adults, and their take on him immediately, they saw him for who he was.
Right. Like there's so many red flags. And I guess my question was how did you guys come across like this as like your topic for the book? Like how did you get involved with the case?
Well, I had the connection with Glick. Ralph had the connection with Carol, and separately, I don't think either one of them, their story would have held up as a book. But when we had the two of them, and then we had everything that was playing out in real time, the investigation, I think then we thought we had a way to tell the story. That's the trick to always writing any kind of book, but especially nonfiction, is where's the narrative? Where's the beginning, the middle, and the end? And I think we realized we had that, and then it was just a question of, all right, let's tell the story. And if you read the book, you realize. I mean, I think what we tried to do is there'll be a chapter from the investigative perspective. There'll be a chapter from Glick's perspective, and a chapter with Carol's perspective. These are contemporaneous. They're going on at the same time. Glick from the very beginning said, "Oh my God, we're all going to jail." That was like day 2 after the murder. And it was 6 more years before anybody came knocking on his door. Do you agree, Ralph? I mean, that's kind of the way we looked at it.
We did. And what you said about Lindsay, what you said about the insurance money, I don't know. I think it was a little bit of deception there because, you would think, well, gee, if he's going after the insurance money, they couldn't have been
Right.
killer wouldn't have been that crazy to lay it out there like that for people, so there was a little bit of misdirection there, I thought. But it was also a really ballsy move. I mean,
It was.
but
It kind of backfired a little bit. If you
oh,
ask
it
me.
absolutely did. But
Yeah,
who else? I mean, think about him floating the story that he was a Green Beret, and inventing all these war stories of crawling through the jungle. And when they brought it up to his wife, number 3, when they brought her in for her deposition in the insurance case, and they asked her about his war record, she just started laughing. And the lawyer says to her, "You think this is funny?" And she says, "Well, I just know that, he never went to war. He was never in the service." And he said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because he's not the kind of guy that, would do those sorts of things." And the lawyer says to her, "Well, what kind of guy does?" And she says, "A guy who doesn't mind being shot at." And, she knew that wasn't Jim Coffin. So, I mean, it was an extremely ballsy guy. I think he should have, had a career in politics. Probably would have been more suited to his talents.
Yeah.
Think big, right?
Right.
Yeah.
George and Ralph, thanks. This is great. But George, I want to direct this to you because you mentioned Tom Capano, you mentioned Rabbi Newlander. Your mind goes back to, and then we have another Dr. Dealer who was out here on the main line. So this guy's not the original Dr. Dealer, and he won't be the last.
Oh, yeah, the cocaine Dr. Snow.
I know, yeah, exactly. But you're thinking back to these men early in life, they get themselves an education. I mean, you don't know what's going on inside them, but you got Tom going to law school, you got Rabbi Newlander going to school, and God knows he probably had a PhD, okay?
Right.
And then you've got Kaufman, and you think, these are people that worked really hard to get the credentials, but deep down inside, we're looking at sociopaths at the core. I mean, to me, this is sociopathic, and they can wine and dine women, and they can seduce, and to think that they end up where they end up, it's just, it's hard to believe. So you want to trust, but you end up just trying here now to understand.
No, I mean, I think that's the thing Ralph and I grappled with is, and as I said earlier, we're not women, so we don't have the same perspective on that. But clearly, all 3 of the people you talked about, Rabbi Newlander, Tom Capano, and Kaufman, presented themselves in a certain way to women that was inconsistent with who they really were, but they were a predator in that sense. They knew how to play that game. And a lot of women paid a price for that. Anne-Marie Fay was killed by Tom Capano. Rabbi Newlander's wife was killed by a hitman he hired, and April Kaufman was killed by a hitman that was set in motion by Dr. Kaufman. Yeah, these guys have it all going for them, but it keeps coming back to, I think, what Ralph said earlier. They think they're the smartest guy in the room, and they lose their moral compass. And whatever they do is okay because they do it. The rules don't apply anymore. But we're living in a world now.
What do you think of the suicide note when he calls himself an MD?
Yeah. What do you think about that?
When he was a DO? What's that about?
Yeah.
Is he wishful thinking in the end, or was that something else in conspiracy that you talk about?
Well,
What
we
do you
got to
think?
put on our tinfoil hats for this one.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
There were people that were friends of his that thought that, he was writing the note under duress with a gun
Yeah.
to his head, sort of like a Jeffrey Epstein scenario. And, they thought it was his way of telling people, I'm doing this under duress and don't believe anything you read.
Yeah, and there are others who believe it was just another little one of these twists where he's still manipulating and playing with everybody's head by doing that, And then he had a couple of phrases in Latin that he threw into the note. It just was, yeah. I think the note is a fascinating piece. I mean, and that's another thing that's kind of unique to the book. The only place you're going to see that entire note is in the book, and
Right.
I think it helps you get a perspective on him through his own words. Yeah.
Yeah, his last will and testament.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What was this cream that he was selling? And
Would you like to buy some?
I'm sorry, I didn't
We
know
can whip
about
you up a tube real quick.
and
Only
$1,000.
10,000 bucks.
Wouldn't
it's-
people question that?
Well, eventually, the insurance companies began to question it because they were getting billed. There was a big scam in Atlantic County. A lot of people have already gone to jail. Their pharmaceutical representatives connected with firemen, policemen, and teachers who all had platinum insurance plans, high-end insurance plans, and they were working a scam. And you would go to a doctor and say, "I got this pain," and the doctor would be in on the deal. You got to give me something for this pain. And so we would write a script for a specific kind of cream, not a cream you can get over the counter. And then the pharmaceutical company had a manufacturer who would manufacture this cream. And then they would bill the insurance company anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 a tube. Now, it's not just unique to Atlantic County, but Ralph mentioned Joey Molino, the mobster. Joey Molino was connected to a similar scam down in Florida, where insurance companies were built out of, I think it was $157 million. So this is, it's been described as the snake oil of the
I
21st
think
century.
it's happening more often than
Yeah.
that even.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's all over the country. And Kaufman tapped into that. And Kaufman, I believe, had he lived, would have been indicted for that. There were several people, a doctor and some pharmaceutical reps and some individuals already have been indicted and pled guilty in Atlantic County. It's an ongoing kind of case. And it was much more lucrative than the pill mill, much more lucrative. But, I mean, the funny thing was, I mean, again, Andrew Glick, very self-deprecating, said, I got insurance, but if I tell them I got a problem, they're going to say, go buy some Bengay. They're not going to give me a script for a cream for $1,000 a tube. That's the difference. But yeah, I mean, that was a major moneymaker for him.
Unbelievable.
And then
Well-
speaking about wanting to trust here, what's the deal with 2020 getting the suicide note when
How about that?
Carol? How about that?
What do you think? Ralph was all over that.
Well, there's really only one suspect here. I mean, the prosecutor had the note. Carol didn't have the note. The lawyers didn't even have the note. So, there's really only one suspect, and that suspect was a prosecutor who got incredible publicity. From 2020, they made him out to be the knight in shining armor and the hero of the story. So, I mean, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out who was the most likely suspect to give 2020 the note. And, I saw Carol was in some anguish when, a note that was very personal and very private, and one that, the court system wouldn't even give her, is read on national TV and used to ridicule her. I thought that was a really low blow. And once again, the press is demonstrating why it's the most hated institution in America. So with stunts like that.
I have one more. Actually, I got two more.
Who's got
One's kind of an aside, but I think what I really want to know is, personally, both of you, do you think that Kaufman killed Frank Mulholland?
Oh, see, that's an interesting question. I think, I think it's possible, but I don't think it's something that could ever be proven. I mean, Glick believes it. Glick believes
Yeah.
that Kaufman arranged for a hot shot, and that was why Frank Mulholland overdosed. He didn't realize what he was taking. Again, it's one of these things where Frank Mulholland's dead, James Kaufman is dead, and quite frankly, I don't think there's anybody who really cares to get to the bottom of it right now because it takes you nowhere.
Right. It's kind of a brick wall, actually. at
Yeah,
this point. Yeah.
but it's another one. It's another one of the crazy twists in the story, you know. And you know, had Frank Mulholland lived and been charged with the murder, this whole thing might have played out totally differently because maybe then he cooperates, and then we get a whole nother explanation for who did what to whom and when and why. You know.
And then my next question. I'm
Yeah.
from South Jersey originally. I born and bred in Burlington County. So like
Yeah.
seeing all of these places mentioned is really wild. I go to Cape May every year. I went to school in Pemberton where the woodshed is. I was out of high school. You know, I was only a year out of high school when the woodshed thing happened. Like it's
Right.
crazy seeing all of these mentioned. And this one's kind of personal. My mom is with us tonight, and her first cousin, George, this one's more for you. Pam, you know what I'm going to ask. My mom's first cousin is Vinnie Filippelli. And
Okay.
we were just, you just wanted to, I had seen you had written some articles, and I just thought that was really funny.
Mr. Universe.
Yes, Mr. Universe, yes.
Right.
So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because I just thought it was. I told Mom that you were doing a Zoom with us, and she, oh, I wonder if he knows Vinny.
No, I know of him. I know him very well. I mean,
Yes.
Ralph,
Yeah,
Vinny was an enforcer for John Stanford. He was
Yeah.
a really big guy out of Pennsauken. Weightlifter,
Yeah.
fascinating guy.
Seen the
Yeah, but
picture.
you know what? In a lot of ways, and this is not to make light of these wise guys or make them to be heroes, but in a lot of ways, those guys were who they were, and they didn't try to hide who they were. Kaufman, on the other hand,
Yeah.
was constantly putting up a different persona depending on his situation,
Mhm.
and I think what he was is more despicable than what any wise guy ever was, for that very reason, and I think it comes across.
Mhm.
And you know, I mean, Carol Weintraub was the last victim in all of this. You know, she was seduced by the memory of 40 years ago, and when she reconnected, that's where she thought that's what she hoped for. And I think for a while, Ralph, wouldn't you say for a while she thought that's what it was?
She what, George? I couldn't hear that last part.
For a while, she thought they had recaptured what they had lost.
Oh, for sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Every day was, fun for her. And, and I also think part of Jimmy Kaufman wanted to go back to who he was 40 years ago, you know?
Yeah,
And
in Carol, he could be that. I mean, the other thing we shouldn't lose sight of was Carol's no dummy. Carol was, what was she, executive head hunter, Ralph? I mean, she was
yes, a very sharp person, very smart person, well-educated, smart, really good at sizing up people, except when it came to picking out husbands, you know?
Yeah, that's another irony.
We all have our faults.
Yeah.
Did you guys enjoy writing a book together? Was it more fun than doing it alone, or?
I did. I was, well, Ralph and I worked a lot at the Inquirer. So I think we worked pretty well together. And for me, yeah, it was a lot of fun. And it was good to have somebody to talk to constantly, because writing can be a real lonely thing sometimes. And we would bounce chapters back and forth. And I think we broke up the approach very well. And I would do it again in a minute. We're talking about trying to do another one right now. We got some ideas.
Definitely having two people on the same thing was a good thing. And if you're by yourself, you can get bogged down with certain parts of the story. And we were able to stop each other from doing that. And so the book would move quickly. That was what we wanted it to do. We wanted the story to move quickly.
The energy,
Yeah.
the energy.
You know, I mean, the other thing I mentioned this, Ralph and I were talking the other day. One of the nicest things people can say to you is, "It's a really easy read." I mean, that's what we're going for. It's not. it shouldn't be a burden to read it. It should flow. And I think we had a pretty good narrative, and I think it flowed pretty well.
Mhm. And
Well, my
sad, too.
question was, what are you gonna do? What's your follow-up? But you kind of hinted at that a little bit.
What do you think, Ralph?
Go for it, George.
Ralph, as I said, Ralph and I have covered a lot of stuff, and we were writing for a blog called BigTrial.net. We covered the trial of a narcotics squad in the Philadelphia PD. 6 guys that were accused of ripping off drug dealers and stealing drugs and stealing money. And it was a federal case in Philadelphia. And as anybody who's followed any of this knows, that 99% of the time the feds win. Well, this case, all 6 of the police officers were found not guilty. The case blew
47
up.
charges. They beat all 47 charges in a RICO indictment. Racketeering. Very unusual.
And I think we're getting to the point where we're maybe getting access to them, and hopefully they'll tell their story. And it's really about, organized crime, disorganized law enforcement, how different agencies, instead of working together, often work against one another, and how out on the streets in the drug underworld, it's a whole different thing. It's not clean and clear and cut and dry. There's a lot of gray areas, and these guys, to be successful, how to live and work in the gray area. And I'm hoping we'll be able to tell that.
Yeah, they're very good at working in the gray areas. And as they explained to us, you can't be a choir boy if you're a narc. You've got to be able to swim with the sharks.
Mhm. Mhm.
Just the whole process of flipping a drug dealer to get to his supplier is something that I found really interesting. And so, the whole business of being a narcotics officer in the war on drugs, like prohibition, you're licked before you start. So we just thought it would be a good cop story to tell, because these guys, one of them ended up in solitary. He's a narcotics officer, and he ended up in solitary confinement for 10 months. They basically took away his constitutional rights because they made him out to be this super dangerous guy and the ringleader, and then every charge against him wound up being disproven. So it's a wacky case, and it's a window into a world that most of us have no idea what's going on.
Right.
So
That sounds great. Sign me up. I'm ready to read.
It is. It's wonderful. And that brings us to Kathy. Kathy, Main Point Books in downtown Wayne, Pennsylvania. We are here to not just support our authors, Ralph Cipriano and George Anastasia, but Kathy Peabock at Main Point Books in downtown Wayne. I thought it was great. I loved it. I just liked being introduced to Ralph Cipriano and George Anastasia. And boy, what is it like to have a book coming? You're now a member of the Pandemic Book Club. You guys, the Pandemic Book Club. There's a lot of authors who have books coming out or had books coming out in 2020. And I feel for you guys not being able to be out there on the road. But I'm glad this is a silver lining for us that you were able to join us here on Zoom.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll all come out the other end of this soon. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That'll be great. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. And Dr. Dealer, I got mine right here.
I'd like to
At
say
your-
hi, Mom. Hi, Mom.
That's great. Congratulations, you guys.
All right.
I really do.
Thank you
Philly
very
says
much.
congratulations.
Hope to see you in
Thank
person.
you.
soon.
Thank you.
Thank
John.
you.
See ya and good luck. Stay well, everybody.